Hello, and let's start looking at the skeletal system. Just a little thing before I get going. There is an artist named Aaron Curran. Anyway, he did this lovely little pictogram where he took all the words of the bone and made it into a picture. So that looks kind of cool. Just to help you learn. Okay, we are going to look at the skeletal system. So we're in chapter 11. And when we look at the components of the skeletal system, there are three components. The bones, the ligaments, which hold the bones to bones, and the cartilage, which is at the end of the bones to help protect it. Now, when we look at the textbook, textbook's kind of weird because it has the introduction way in the summary at the bottom. So when we look at the overview of what we're going to look at, here is the three components of the bone, and here are our 6 functions of the skeletal system. And we will look at more detail as we go through. But the main one is to support and give shape to our body. So if you think of support, you've got your vertebrae, you've got your shoulders. In terms of shape, your rib cage gives you shape, your skull gives you shape. To protect your organs, you have your brain case, your cranium, and you also have your rib cage. When it comes to movement, the skeletal system acts as levers for our muscles to pull upon, which gives us the movement. Then when it talks about producing blood cells, the bone marrow is the location of our blood cell production. Maintaining homeostasis is kind of vague right now, but we'll look at it in terms of calcium is stored in your blood. And when you need calcium is stored in your bone. And when you need calcium in your blood, it will take it out of your bone and put it back into your blood. And then to produce endocrine hormones, which we'll look at the end. When we look at it, you can start with the 6 functions of your skeletal system in your note page. And as we go through the rest of it, we will look at more detail in terms of what their examples are. Well, I kind of gave them to you, so did you catch them? It'll be good to see. Okay, now when it comes to the skeleton or the skeletal system, back to the textbook again. This is figure 11.2.2. Anything that's on this picture is testable. So you need to know your bones. When it comes to the skull, there is many bones that make up the skull and the face. So we're just going to call it the cranium at this point. Later on, we'll break it down into more detail. When you look at the color, if it shows up here, you can see the beigey section is called the axial skeleton. And that is the one that's along the main axis. So you have your skull, you have your vertebrae, and you have your ribs. That is your axial. Then the appendicular is everything that adds to your appendages. So that is your what's called your shoulder girdle, which is your scapula, and your clavicle. Then you've got your arm bones. Then you have your pelvic girdle, which is your hip bones, and then you have your leg bones. Those are what makes up the axial and the appendicular skeleton. As I said, you do need to know all the bones on this diagram. So there is a game called Whack-A-Bone that is helpful to learn your bones. And there's also some other bone games that I've put on your Blackboard page, so we can look at those. So I mentioned that there are 3 parts that make up the skeletal system. The cartilage, the bones, as we mentioned, and we'll talk more about the different bones. Then there's cartilage, and cartilage is dense connective tissue. And mainly we're looking at 2 types of cartilage. The cartilage along the end of the bone is called hyaline cartilage, and the cartilage that is in between our vertebrae, which is fibrocartilage. Then we are also looking at ligaments, which don't show up in this picture. But if you look at the video I used to introduce the course where you've got all the bones building, you can see the ligaments and the tendons on them. The ligaments hold bone to bone to help keep them in place. Here's another picture of our axial and appendicular skeleton, and here's a little game you can play to keep them straight. Okay, as I said, there was 6 functions of the the 6 functions of the skeletal system. The first one we're going to look at is support, shape, and protection. So it's going to put them together. When we look at the body, the bones give the rigid structure. Otherwise, we'd just be a bag of soft tissue. Bones are very hard. And because they are hard, they will protect from the softer tissue inside. And the skull is a good example. It protects the brain. The vertebrae protects our nervous spinal cord. And the rib cage will protect our heart and lungs and major blood vessels that lead to the heart and lungs. Good. When it comes to movement, I said the bones act as levers for the muscles to pull on. And here's an example. So you have the lever of your, so here's your shoulder joint. And then here is your radius at the bottom. And by having a muscle pull on it, it adds to the movement of the arm. Next thing we're going to look at is hematopoiesis. Hemo is for blood and poiesis is creating. So hematopoiesis is the description of the blood cells being created in the bone marrow. And we will go into more detail on that when we get to the blood section. But there is a certain part of red bone marrow up at the top and the ends of the long bones where blood cells are created. When we look at hemostasis, bones act as a way for calcium and phosphorus to sort of have a sink. So this way, if our body needs it, it'll take it out of our bones. If we've got too much, it'll put it in our bones. We have to be careful though, because if you take too much calcium out of your bones, it will weaken your bones. The phosphorus also acts as a way for the blood to help the bones to help balance the pH of the blood. Good. Now, males and females do have a bit different of a hip bone, and it has to do with the fact that babies are carried by females, so their hip bones are more of a basket. So there's the 2 main difference. One is this opening is larger. And the second is the pelvic or the pubic arch is larger. And this basically just provides the females to be more robust in order to carry a baby. Okay. I said you didn't need to know the specific bones of the cranium, but let's have a quick look at it, just because you've probably heard the terms before when we're talking about the lobes of the brain. So there are 8 bones in the brain box: the occipital, temporal, parietal, and frontal. And then there's a cool one on the inside called erythmoid and one called the sphenoid. And then there are 14 bones that make up your face. And one of them is the zygomatic arch from the zygomat. And then you've got a vomer, palatine, and one that's very common, the mandible. The mandible is just the movable jaw. Okay. You don't need to know these, but if you go on to any higher courses, you'll need to know them later on. Good. The vertebral column is divided into 4 sections. The cervical, which has 7, the thoracic, which has 12 vertebrae, the lumbar, which has 5 vertebrae, and the pelvis area, which is the sacrum and the cocci, which are fused together. So in total, there's 24 vertebrae, and in between, there's an intervertebral disc. You do need to know each of the regions in order and how many bones are attached to it. Now, a normal spine has this beautiful S shape to it, which unfortunately all us texters are losing the cervical bend. The S shape helps support the weight of the head a lot easier and gives us good flexibility. It also adds as a shock absorber, to absorb the jarring motion as we walk. Good. When we look at the rib cage, there are 3 different types of ribs. There are true ribs, which if you look at them when they spin here, you will see that each true rib has its own little connection to the sternum or the breastbone here, the breastplate. And then there are false ribs, and if you look at the false rib, it all goes, 3 of them go to one point, and then that joins to the breastplate. Then there are something called floating ribs, and there are 2 floating ribs at the back because they float and they do not attach to the front. So true, false, and floating. Make sure you know them all. Good. When we look at the appendicular skeleton has the appendages, the arms and legs on it, along with the girdles, the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle. With the upper limbs, you need to know the humerus, then there's the ulna and the radius. And if you hold your arm out, the ulna is the one that is underneath. So that's how I remember the ulna and the radius. And when you turn your wrist, the radius rotates around the ulna. So that might help you remember them. Then there are carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. And those are the bones in our arm. Good. When you look at the lower limb, you've got the pelvic girdle, then you've got the femur, the patella, which is the kneecap, the tibia, which is the larger bone that holds up the knee, and then you have the fibula, which does not articulate with the femur. The tibia, the way I remember that is the tibia are together. Good. Then when you look at the feet, you've got the tarsals, the metatarsals, and again the phalanges. And the way I remember this is tarsals and foot both have a T in it. So that's the way I remember that tarsals are there. Now the shoulder girdle is there to help anchor the shoulder and give it movement and support. The shoulder girdle has, also called the pectoral girdle, has 2 main bones, the clavicle and the scapula. Scapula, good word. Then when we look at the pelvic girdle, the pelvis actually has 3 different bones on it. The ilium, which are the wings on the side, the pubis, which goes along to the front, hence where you talk about the pubic region. And then there's what's called the sit bones, which are the ischium, which are 2 bones at the back. These, this part here in green, that is the sacrum, which is part of the vertebrae. And it has these holes in it to allow for nerves to come out. These holes down here in the ischium are sites for muscle attachment. Good. That is the introduction to the first part of the skeletal system when we talk about the bones. There will be a second part when I talk about the bone cells themselves.